Hi. I hope you'll enjoy the episode you're about to listen to, but you should know that this podcast would not be possible without the generous support of some of our listeners who contribute either through Patreon or directly on our Buzzsprout website. I'd like to thank Brian Heyer, Brandon and Sarah Gierach, Steve Zank, Scott Henrich, Deborah Hilger, Mikhail Legner, Abigail and Noah Broyles, and Rosa. Thank you. Hi, welcome back to another episode of the Lutheran History Podcast, our first episode for the year 2026. We welcome back a good friend of the podcast, Dr. Tim Grundmeier from Martin Luther College. He's shared a lot of insights on various topics, but this is kind of a big one for Dr. Grundmeier here. We're going to talk about his book, Lutheranism and American Culture, The Making of a Distinctive Faith in the Civil War Era. A big project is now finally in print, so we're excited to talk about that today. Thank you for joining us once again, Dr. Grundmeier.
Well, thanks for having me, Ben. Yeah, I feel like we've talked about this off air a couple times, and it's fun for it to finally be in print and getting to talk about it for real.
Yeah, and I just had a conversation with board members of the Lutheran Historic Conference just this morning, the day we're recording this interview, and some of them already had their copies and were excited to see it too. So I'm glad it's being well received already, and we hope our listeners will pick up a copy. And we're going to talk about what you cover a bit in the book without giving the whole book away today. So first, just tell us what led you to this topic and the resulting book project that came from it.
Yeah, so right before I began my doctoral program at Baylor University, I read a good number of books on the subject of religion and the American Civil War. It was actually a time where that topic was really, I don't know, hot, you might say. There was a lot of writing on it. And I was very convinced by Mark Noll's argument that the Civil War represented a theological crisis in American Christianity. But my question that I kept coming back to is, where do Lutherans fit into this mix? And that's what really led me down the path to research that question, and then eventually write this book. And so, like, the conclusion I came to is you can't really understand the history of American Lutheranism without understanding the central role played by the Civil War and Reconstruction in the formation of what I consider a kind of distinctively American Lutheran identity.
Yeah, and I think that's an important hole to fill because normally, at least a lot of people kind of put theology in one box, warfare in another, maybe politics and warfare together, but you're tying sort of all these things together from this period and this perspective.
Right. And it's interesting because I think Lutheran historians in the past have actually seen like the connection between, say, World War I and the American Lutheran story. And maybe there's a more obvious connection there because of especially for German American Lutheranism, the anti-Germanism in the United States during the war and things of that nature. But yeah, I'm really trying to show how the Civil War has a similarly large impact on the story of American Lutheranism.
Yeah. So with that being said, you right up front in the book tell us you have two goals that you hope this book will accomplish. Well, what are those goals and why did you make them the goal for the project?
Right. Yeah. I like to tell people I wrote this book for basically two different audiences. The one audience are those people who study and are interested in the Civil War in 19th century American religious history. And I want to show how Lutherans fit into that larger picture, how they resemble other Protestants, how they differ from them, and then how they too were influenced by the debates of the Civil War and Reconstruction. And then on the other hand, I'm writing for fellow Lutherans. And you kind of just mentioned this before. I think we have the tendency when telling our history to maybe downplay put off to one side the larger political and social contexts, almost as if like Lutheran history develops in this kind of vacuum. And so I'm trying to show my fellow Lutherans how Lutherans in the 19th century were greatly influenced by these debates of the Civil War. So I think, one of the things that I'm really trying to account, and so when I said the two goals of my book, on the one hand, you don't want to shortchange the complexity of American Lutheranism, right? There's all these different synods, ethnic groups, different factions, schools of thought, and you want to be attentive to that and respect that. On the other hand, it's kind of easy to sometimes lose the forest for the trees. So I think the big picture here that I'm trying to convey is there really is the development in the 19th century of this broadly shared identity by a large swath of Lutherans. I say it has four components. I say it's a confessionalism in doctrine, a separatism from other Protestants to varying degrees, a broadly conservative outlook on social and political matters, and then this embrace of American exceptionalism to one degree or the other. And so the argument of the book is that when we're talking about that distinctive American Lutheran identity, the Civil War and Reconstruction play this major role in its development.
Yeah, sounds like a pretty good premise and an argument that you laid out here and quite convincing in the book. But you also, of course, are engaging with what other historians have said and done. You already mentioned kind of the general idea related to what Mark Knoll has done, but what have been some of the other questions historians have been asking about Lutheranism in this, kind of this broader Civil War era, 1840s through 1870s? And what do you think of their conclusions?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe the biggest takeaway I have with when we're talking about the what other historians have written about is that to a large degree, I wouldn't say the Civil War context is ignored. Any general history of the time period certainly makes mention of the Civil War. Well, mention the debates about slavery, political contexts. But my sense was that generally speaking, there's not really a connection made between Lutherans debating these issues in what you might call the secular realm with the debates that are happening in you might say, the church realm, right? But these two things are going hand in hand. And so I'm trying to explore the interactions between the two. Probably there was actually a book we talked about on the podcast. Oh, it must have been a few years ago, a book called The Rise and Fall of American Lutheran Pietism. I'd say that's the book. It's a 35-year-old book, I think, maybe a little bit longer, that does explore some of these connections. I have some disagreements with the interpretation of that book. I think the author, again, this is just a difference of interpretation, but he makes the argument that there's this almost easy mapping of the confessionalism with the slavery debates. And I
Mhm.
think what my book shows is it's a lot more complicated than that. It's almost as if what Keening says, those who are the more, if you will, we'll talk about who these people are, I'm sure, in the podcast. The more kind of American Lutherans tended to be more anti-slavery, and the more quote unquote confessional Lutherans tended to be more at least anti-slavery. In some cases, that's true, but in other cases, it's not. It's a lot more complicated story than that.
Yeah, and that reminds me the other book we talked about at the same time, Lutherans in Crisis. Well, that almost seems like, hey, it's the same era, same subject matter, but you're taking it farther. The social aspects in the American Lutheran Pietism and the theological and worship stuff in the Lutherans in Crisis, you're kind of bringing it all together in the same conversation.
Yeah. And again, both are fine books, but this is, what historians do. Well, you build off the work of others, but you also offer new evidence and new interpretations. So, but yeah, those are two books that I'm definitely in conversation with in my book.
Yeah. Oh, good. And our listeners have a reference point now to other episodes we've done,
Yeah.
and maybe kind of make a little group reading or group listening out of these
Yeah, go
topics.
back and listen.
Yeah, good. So Now we're still into wrapping up our kind of introduction to this topic. We're about to get ready into the content of it, but you make a pretty interesting claim, a pretty bold claim, which I like it. In the front part of your book, you say that the story of Lutheranism is indispensable to understanding religion in America during the Civil War era. Well, why are you making such a bold statement? I think a lot of us Lutherans think, well, we're kind of these guys off on the sidelines of everything. We're not the center stage of American experience in the Civil
Right.
War. But yeah,
And I don't make the claim that Lutherans are at the center stage. I guess that, this is the thing we historians do. You make a bold claim to, you're trying to show why your book matters beyond. And again, I think you can convince Lutherans why this is important pretty easily. But, like I said, one of my audiences is, fellow historians of the Civil War era, of American religious history. Well, why do Lutherans matter? And so I say they matter for three reasons at least. One is just there's a lot of Lutherans, and if you want to tell the full story of American religious history in the mid 19th century, like Lutherans got to have to be a part of that. By the time you get to the end of the 19th century, Lutherans, the only denominations with more members than Lutherans are Roman Catholics, Methodists, and Baptists, right? So they're the fourth largest denomination, third largest Protestant denomination. So again, if you want to tell the full story, Lutherans are a big chunk of it. Another reason I think why Lutherans are important for non-Lutherans to understand that study this era of history is that Lutherans occupy a kind of unique position in the American religious landscape. A historian named John Jurdy, I hope I pronounced his name correctly, wrote that Lutherans were neither part of the Protestant center nor were they the Catholic other, right? So they kind of have this in-between position between kind of the mainstream and the outsider in American religious culture. And there's the theological distinctiveness of Lutheranism. So, I think this helps show that there were different approaches to the debates of the Civil War and Reconstruction than kind of the typical denominations that are explored. And then finally, I think, there's a growing literature in Civil War studies on what's going on in the regions where there are a lot of Lutherans. So in like the mid-Atlantic states, so places like Pennsylvania and Ohio, well, is Ohio Midwest or mid-Atlantic, I guess, kind of in the middle. But this is and actually, this is something else worth mentioning here. By the time you get to like the 1860s, 1870s, it's still that area of kind of Pennsylvania and the surrounding area that's still the center of kind of the demographic center of American Lutheranism. But of course, there's a lot of Lutherans in the Midwest as well. And I think exploring how those areas of the country are debating the Civil War, what they see as the meaning of the Civil War, Lutherans can kind of shed some light on that because they're just so numerous in those areas. So, I mean, ultimately for me, I think Lutherans are inherently important, but you expect me to say that because I'm a Lutheran. But part of the goal of the book, as we've already said, is to show non-Lutherans how Lutherans fit into the mix and also why they matter. Maybe indispensable is a bit too bold of a claim, but I'll stick with it for now.
yeah. Well, maybe put it the opposite way. Would you really be missing something? Would you be missing out on a big part of the story if you just ignored Lutherans entirely? And I think that's basically the same thing as what you're
Yeah,
saying. And yeah, I think
indispens yeah,
yeah, you
indispensable to
could
the full story, if you
yeah,
if you will. Yeah,
yeah, could not dispose of them. Yeah. Good.
yeah,
All right. Well, I think now we're kind of understanding why this book and where you're coming from and where we're going to go. But now let's get into some of the content. What are we going to talk about or find in this book as people look at it? So, but first, before we get into the details, just set the stage for us, please, about Lutherans in America in this antebellum, this
yeah,
pre-war period.
yeah. I usually think a good place to begin is 1830, not because there's anything particular that happens in that year, but it's kind of a good place to kind of see, what's the status of American Lutheranism in this is several decades after the American Revolution. There's about 50,000 Lutherans in the Lutheran members in the United States. That doesn't necessarily mean the number of Lutherans. It's tricky with 19th century church membership and demographics. I think usually you can take the number of Lutherans that are officially members of like communicant members and multiply that by a factor of three or four, and that kind of gives like the number of people adjacent to the Lutheran Church. So, take that for what you will. But these Lutherans are in 1830 in the United States, almost all descendants of like the colonial migrations to British North America from Germany. So these are often second, third, fourth generation Lutherans in the United States, centered in the area of Pennsylvania. I mean, we mentioned this before. That's kind of the center of Lutheranism, really up through the Civil War era in the United States. I'd say the other thing about like Lutherans in around 1830, they're institutionally not united. There's this organization called the General Synod, which is founded in 1820, but only 4 out of the 10 Lutheran synods in the United States are actually a member of it, and many of the largest ones aren't a member of it. Lutherans also are kind of lagging behind in building up educational institutions, theological periodicals, compared to some of the other Protestant groups in the United States. And, there's some who are content with this. They're kind of content in their, if you will, Pennsylvania German subculture. There are others that are calling for Lutherans to take more of the center stage, if you will, in American religious life. And I think that kind of feeds into the some of the developments that'll happen in the antebellum era, if we want to talk about like the 1830s and 1840s. In the first chapter, I talk about these 3 different Lutheran, you might say, factions or groups that emerge in the 1830s, 1840s. Would you like me to kind of lay those out?
Yeah, it's something we've definitely talked about in the past, but I think it's a key part of your book. So yeah, let's talk about these
Yeah,
these kind of Lutheran divisions, so to speak, or
right.
cultures.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. So in the 1830s, 1840s, and I'm drawing on the work of a German Reformed theologian living in the United States, Philip Schaff, who lays out this 3-part division within American Lutheranism he's writing in the early 1850s. And I think it holds up pretty well as the kind of 3 main groups of Lutherans. You got the New Lutherans, as they're sometimes known. Sometimes they're called the American Lutherans, although that's a name I don't really like very much, just because it kind of implies that this group is definitively American and the other Lutheran groups are not. So the people that are the New Lutherans are people like Samuel Schmucker, Benjamin Quartz, John Bachman in the South. And kind of my shorthand to understand what they're trying to do is, and this is simplifying it a little bit, but not maybe too much, they really see the future of Lutheranism as, in many ways, partnering with American evangelicals. So they practice revivalism. They're partnering with American evangelicals in the areas of like social reform. They also are downplaying, maybe even rejecting some traditional Lutheran doctrines that they see as kind of too Catholic, things like the real presence of Christ in the Lord's Supper. And so the key thing, though, is in the antebellum era, they are the largest and I would say most culturally influential of the 3 Lutheran groups that Schaff talks about. Then there's the Old Lutherans, which is in the antebellum era pretty much synonymous with the Missouri Synod. You might say the Norwegian Synod they're in partnership with the Missouri Synod eventually, and you might classify them that way, maybe a few other groups. They are seeking to defend the traditional doctrines that the New Lutherans are rejecting. They're very much opposed to any cooperation with other Protestants. And I think another key thing to note is they are the smallest group in the antebellum era. I think on like the eve of the Civil War in 1860. I don't have the statistics right in front of me. I think the Missouri Synod and its allies are about 10% of Lutherans in the United States, right? So, and then there's the group that is called the moderate Lutherans, which, as you can imagine, is kind of in between the new Lutherans and the old Lutherans. They're hesitant about some of the ideas of the new Lutherans, the kind of partnering with American evangelicals, the rejection of certain doctrines in the Augsburg Confession. But I think the key thing here is the moderate Lutherans, generally speaking, are more they don't like the old they like the new Lutherans more than the old Lutherans, is how I'd put it. So, for example, the Pennsylvania Synod, which is the oldest Lutheran church body in the United States, kind of the quintessential representative of moderate Lutheranism, joins the General Synod in 1853. And the General Synod is largely controlled by New Lutherans. So basically, the kind of compromise reached is we can agree to disagree on these matters. But the big goal we should have in mind is growing the unity of the Lutheran Church, and the key organization in doing this is the General Synod. So those are kind of the three groups that I lay out in the antebellum era, and I think that's going to help shape what's going forward once we get to the Civil War.
Yeah. So those are the groups and yeah, the set the stage for us there. But can we get a little bit more into the details? Okay, you say they're different, perhaps with doctrine or things, but you also get into kind of the social atmosphere and climate too of just being in America. So what were some of the actual fault lines? Like what view certain view on this, that, or the other would put someone in these different camps?
Yeah, that's a good question. In one of my chapters, I outlined these three big debates that are happening in the 1850s. One is the debate over immigration. And it's basically like which of these three different Lutheran groups, parties, schools of thought is going to win over some of these new immigrants that are coming in from Germany and also Scandinavia. Some of the old Lutherans think, well, a lot of these new immigrants, they're not dedicated enough Lutherans. So many of the new Lutherans have this idea that, oh, actually, some of these immigrants coming from Germany are, will they make the kind of Lutherans of the sort that we're trying to build? So actually, I think the moderate Lutherans tend to be the most successful in attracting these German immigrants to their cause. The other big debate is on the issue of confessional subscription. This really, I mean, this has been building for some time, but I'd say it's in the 1850s where it really this is when the debates really start to heat up. So we've talked, I think, in a previous podcast, perhaps maybe some of your listeners are familiar with the episode of the definite platform. Can we assume that listeners know what we're talking about here, or should I
Yeah,
explain?
I think we should explain. Yeah, the definite platform probably came up in those two other books we mentioned, but yeah, let's
Yes.
get a refresher on that because
Yeah.
that's
So
kind of pivotal.
yeah, it is. It is, and it is, and maybe I can get into that a little bit. This is a proposal put forward by people like Samuel Schmucker, Benjamin Kurtz, another theologian, that the General Synod should, or at least the member synods of the General Synod, should adopt an American recension to the Augsburg Confession. Basically, like there's these doctrines that we no longer agree with, chiefly surrounding the sacraments. They're too quote unquote Catholic. So let's create an American edition of the Augsburg Confession that we can use as our doctrinal standard. It's widely rejected. And I guess where I somewhat disagree with how it's been characterized in some other histories is it's often kind of presented as like the culmination of like these debates about confessionalism. But in many ways, it's not really the culmination. It's almost the beginning, right? And the other thing that I think some people miss is the rejection of this proposal for an American addition to the Augsburg Confession. There's a few that adopt it. The rejection is not motivated by like an increasing confessionalism. Like the big problem that many in the General Synod have with it, whether they're new Lutheran or moderate Lutheran, is that it's disturbing the peace of the General Synod, right? We had agreed that we can have these different interpretations, and now you have these people saying, no, it has to be this way and not the other. So in many ways, it kind of sets off this confessional debate that's kind of been simmering. But what I try to show in the book is that it's really during the Civil War itself when those debates really heat up. But the other thing I will say though, it's during this time in the 1850s that you have a fourth movement in American Lutheranism in the antebellum era kind of growing. It's a group that I call like the confessional movement in the General Synod. And so this is people like Charles Porterfield Krauth, Joseph Seiss, William Passavant, who they've kind of gotten in other histories lumped in with the moderate Lutherans, but there's actually a real distinction between the two groups. And not to get into the weeds too much, but I mean, a lot of these people like Krauth and Seiss and Passavant, they're trying to get out of the Pennsylvania German subculture too, right? They want to they're writing just in English, right? They're not trying to kind of preserve like that German culture in some ways. And they're comfortable still cooperating with other Protestants. They just want to see the General Synod have a firmer commitment to the Augsburg Confession, right? Although now their views are, of course, going to change over the course of the Civil War, but we can get into that a little bit. I mean, you did ask, though, you asked about the kind of larger social and political context. And I mean, I think my big takeaway in the antebellum era is that there are these important disagreements between different Lutheran factions on the issues of slavery, on other political debates. But really, what you see is this effort to not let those be divisive, right? Including like especially like the slavery issue. I mean, there's plenty of writings on it, disagreements about it, but there's this general sense among Lutherans that we have to remain united, especially Lutherans in the General Synod, and we can't let the slavery issue divide us. And so they're often showing themselves as contrasts with like other Protestant denominations. So like the Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists all split over the issue of slavery in the antebellum era, but Lutherans are actually quite proud that they haven't let the slavery issue divide them. So you'll see the different approaches to slavery, but in many ways they yeah, kind of suppress the heat of those disagreements as much as they can, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. So perhaps not ironically, but something like that, by trying to not be affected by the political, social issues, that in and of itself is affecting the Lutheran, or at least the general Lutheran mindset about things. Our stance is to
Yep.
be unified versus
Yep.
anything else.
100%. Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it's interesting. There is a really just fascinating exchange between William Passavant, who I mentioned before, and one of the leaders of the confessional movement, and then John Bachman, the new Lutheran leader in the South, on this issue of slavery. And they have this exchange in Passavant's periodical, The Missionary, where they go back and forth on the issue of slavery. But the kind of conclusion they both come to is like, well, good men in the Lutheran Church can have these strong disagreements. Whereas you see in other denominations, those disagreements ultimately lead to schism. Now, eventually, as you're kind of like foreshadowing here, I mean, the Civil War, like the dam finally bursts is basically how I interpret it.
Yeah. Well, let's just talk about it.
Yeah,
And yeah, let's get into the Civil War itself. And I guess let's let that flow naturally into Reconstruction because they're obviously connected. But how did this huge event in American history, impact the views and influence the disputes or the nature of the disputes and how
yeah,
they were carried out, perhaps is a better way to put it, among American Lutherans?
yeah. So as I kind of alluded to, in my view, the Civil War makes it so that all these kind of pent up disagreements finally kind of burst out into open conflict in the Lutheran Church. Maybe, I should maybe just highlight here that I think modern day Lutherans might be quite surprised to see how much Lutherans in the Civil War use their religious periodicals, right, to comment on like the broader issues of the day. I'm sure you've seen that in your own research. They're not, I mean, just one example. So in October 1861, William Passavant and Charles Porterfield Krauth, these two leaders in the confessional movement, begin their new church paper. It's called the Lutheran and Missionary. It's kind of meant to be the confessional alternative to the Lutheran Observer, which is the kind of the new Lutheran, or as they sometimes call themselves, the New School Lutheran church paper. And in that inaugural issue, I mean, there's just as much about the debates in the Lutheran Church as there is about like the importance of preserving the Union in the Civil War, right? So these things are often going together in the same place, the same writings. So yeah, so Lutherans are debating all kinds of issues in the Civil War. They're debating obviously the central issue of slavery. There's debating issues about the role of preachers and politics. To what extent it should political preaching or political commentary in religious writings be allowable? How far can you go? How far shouldn't you? They're talking about, the extent to which the United States is a Christian nation and things of that nature, the duties of Christians to their government. And there are different positions on all these issues that are only kind of inflaming things. But the first real schism that comes kind of over the first years of the Civil War when, and not surprisingly, several of the Southern Lutheran synods break away from the General Synod and form their own separate Confederate General Synod. It's about 10% of the General Synod that breaks away at that time. So the synods themselves kind of declare that they're no longer part of the General Synod already in 1861, but the official formation of that Confederate General Synod happens in 1863. But I think where my book really, I mean, that schism of the Southern Lutherans, that's been written about before. I think where my book breaks new ground is talking about how these debates about the Civil War influence the Northern Lutherans in their disagreements. So you want me to get into that or any follow-up points that I should bring up?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're kind of building here to a big shift in how American Lutherans just kind of describe themselves, view themselves, and almost even how they believe.
Yeah,
Just how they have faith. Well, not in a theological sense, but like what does that look like? What does that
right.
do? So yeah, let's get into that. How the Civil War and then kind of those discussions after are part of this.
Yeah, right. So within the Northern General Synod, right, because the Southern synods have broken away, there's these two competing interpretations of the Civil War that are in effect. So the confessional movement, and they've kind of joined up now with the moderate Lutherans. They've kind of come to be known as the Old School Party. So there's kind of really these two parties in the General Synod, and kind of using the same language as the Presbyterians, the Old School and the New School. So the Old School Party, the confessional Lutherans and moderate Lutherans, their basic contention is that what's this Civil War all about? It's about standing on constitutional principle. So like the Confederacy has broken with the American Constitution, and so the rebellion needs to be suppressed to uphold the constitutional order of the United States. And they apply that lesson in many ways to the debates going on within the General Synod itself. Just as we're standing in the Civil War for the U.S. Constitution, we should also stand for the truth of the Augsburg Confession. Now, what's the chicken or the egg there? It's hard to know. I mean, both are kind of happening simultaneously. But again, the whole point is that like the Civil War context is shaping the rhetoric, shaping the discourse. The New School Lutherans have an interpretation of the Civil War that basically says, look, the reason why this war broke out is because of the inability of people to compromise. right? And so the South finally parted with the idea of compromise, and now we're at war, and this is a calamity. And just in the same way, in the Lutheran Church, the old school Lutherans are undermining our ability to compromise. And so because of that, just like in the political realm, we should be about finding common ground. So also in the theological realm, we should not let these, and this is the word that's often used at the time, these non-fundamentals, these non-essentials divide us. And ultimately, these disputes are going to come to a head just after the war concludes in 1866, when old school Lutherans withdraw from the General Synod. There's a whole big scene at the meeting being held that year in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And then the following year, these old school Lutherans are going to lead to the formation of a new Lutheran federation called the General Council. And again, kind of what I'm trying to show in the book is how much the Civil War and the debates surrounding it influence these decisions.
Yeah, kind of in the sense we need to have a take a decisive step here as far as where we want to be, kind of bring the civil war among Lutherans to a close, and how are you going to do that, right?
Right.
Is I guess another way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. Like, you take a person like Charles Porterfield Krauth, who is in many ways one of the central figures of the book. I mean, he's a towering figure in American Lutheran history, but I mean, he's so central to this because he's editing this church paper, and he's one of the ones making these kind of arguments together. I mean, he had been before the Civil War been personally convinced about the truth of the doctrines in the Augsburg Confession. What changes for him over the Civil War is that we can't agree to disagree on these matters anymore. He has this kind of article where he lays down the gauntlet. It comes right after the Civil War concludes, and he says something along the lines of, I don't have it in front of me, in both church and state, what we have been taught is that any compromise on principle is ungodly. Again, I'm probably messing up the quote exactly, but that's the basic gist of it. And there he's making the explicit connection, right? And so for him, like the thing that he comes to see is like all doctrines in the Augsburg Confession need to be adhered to, right? Otherwise, we can't go along to get along anymore. So
Yeah, and I guess then a follow-up question, how did this kind of impact, I should say, the Lutherans' view on just societal issues in America? Are they going to say, let's just agree to disagree and be united, or now are they coming with more concrete positions and statements, say, for example, on temperance or Reconstruction
right.
or things like that?
The way I see it is that the Civil War kind of becomes in the 19th century the high point of Lutheran, this is just a general statement, Lutheran political commentary, if you will. It's the time where they're least reticent to make statements about what's going on in the political realm, how we as Lutherans should look at it, making connections to the church. I mean, what you really see in the era of Reconstruction is something of a retreat from that, right? Whether it's conscious or unconscious, I think it's kind of both. I think on the one hand, I mean, the Civil War is such a cataclysmic event, right? It's of course people are going to be making I mean, you can't avoid it, right? But I think there is a sense among some Lutherans. I mean, you see this shift, especially among like people like Krauth, that maybe we took our political engagement almost too far, right? That there should be more of a hesitancy to comment on the affairs of, if politics, the wider culture. And again, it's never articulated like clearly, like, well, we were having this actual retreat from this engagement. But I mean, it's borne out in the sources. It's borne out in the church papers that are kind of no longer commenting on these matters. Now, during Reconstruction, because I think this is probably where you want to go next,
Mhm.
it's not as if Lutherans are completely silent on these matters. They certainly voice their opinions. but it's declining, I would say. It's not every issue of the paper of each church paper where there's like tons of commentary. It's more like sporadic. And so, yeah, I think that to me is one of the big shifts I see. It's kind of when I talk about this idea of this political and social conservatism that is that develops over the course of the 19th century. A lot of that is this idea of, well, for lack of a better way of putting it, politics and religion should it mix, right? Or at least should be very carefully delineated. And it was maybe less careful during the Civil War. Does that does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, that's a good clarification. So yeah, let's kind of take the Lutherans through Reconstruction and the end of the century. What big,
Yeah.
you set the stage for us at the beginning, old school or old, I shouldn't say old school. That's a different term. Old,
Well,
moderate and or mild and new
yeah.
Lutherans. How does it kind of get reshuffled by
Right.
the end of the century?
Right. And I already kind of alluded to how when the moderate Lutheran these terms are tricky because what any kind of groups or factions, different, they're not always consistent in how they use the terms, right? Again, the term I kind of settled on when the confessional movement of, like, say, Charles Porterfield Krauth begins partnering with, like, the Pennsylvania Synod, these moderate Lutherans, the term that is most accepted by everyone is these are the kind of old school Lutherans, so both confessional and moderate together. I think once they form the General Council, well, it's just you just refer to them as the General Council Lutherans, right? So on the one hand, you have the General Council, you have the General Synod, what remains of it after the Civil War, and they still are continuing on in many ways the new school idea. But then you have, and we've kind of lost track of them, but they're super important as I'll show the, if you will, the old Lutherans, the Missouri Synod and its partners. And to me, the story of Reconstruction is how the General Council really sets itself up to be, they believe they are going to be the central organization of Lutheranism in America. They even use the phrase, I mean, talk about like the Civil War context. We're forming this new quote unquote more perfect Lutheran union, right? But what shockingly happens over the course of the first several years of Reconstruction, so from like 1865 to 1872, is that who emerges as the kind of almost dominant force in American Lutheranism? It's the previously small and kind of almost obscure Missouri Synod. And it's just crazy to me how how much of a shift this is so quickly. So again, after the Civil War, like the Missouri Synod and its partner, the Norwegian Synod, 10 to 15% of American Lutherans. 1872, the Synodical Conference is founded. So the Missouri Synod, Norwegian Synod, the Ohio Synod, who we haven't talked about yet, that had already always been kind of in the moderate Lutheran camp, but had never joined the General Synod. You have the Wisconsin Synod, another kind of moderate Lutheran synod that becomes more confessional and conservative, and a few others. They will form the Synodical Conference in 1872. And when it's founded, it's almost 40% of all Lutherans in the United States. So again, it's just amazing. And the general people in the General Council are, in many ways, they're kind of almost moving in the direction of Missouri Synod theology, right? In some ways, with differences, of course, they'll never officially get together. And so this, again, what I try to show in the chapter on Reconstruction is how, just as in the Civil War, those political and social contexts are influential. It's the same thing in the era of Reconstruction. There's this sense among Lutherans that, this is an era of kind of political radicalism, and that Lutherans are kind of standing against kind of just radicalism more generally. I mean, I don't think it's unsurprising that it's at this time that Charles Porterfield Krauth writes his kind of magnum opus, The Conservative Reformation and Its Theology, and how Lutherans, he writes, like, stand against radicalism and revolutionism. And again, those connections are often explicitly made. So, yeah. So again, this, just to, if I may, like, this was the chapter that I spent the longest time on, chapter 5. because it's a such a such tremendous changes that are happening in American Lutheran history in just the 7 year span between 1865 and 1872. It was a lot to unpack. And I haven't even talked about like the Southern Lutherans and what's going on there, but we only have so much time. But yeah, some people have asked me, what's your favorite chapter of the book? And I often say chapter 5. Maybe it's just because it took me the longest to write.
Yeah, well, you pull everything together in that chapter, right? It's a lot of description, and now it's like, hey, this is where it
Yeah,
comes together.
right,
Yeah, yeah, because it's undeniable. There's this huge shift throughout the 19th century, and I think maybe when I was asking about other historians, I think one point that I saw was that, oh, well, it's something like, well, the conservatives just grew because the immigrants were more conservative, and the tide of
right.
immigration just kind of made this inevitable. And you kind of you say that's not really how it worked, and
Yeah,
that's a good point.
right. It's true. I think that's if there's one, I mean, there's several big takeaways I hope people take from the book. One is I really want to challenge this idea of, and this actually goes back to another book that I don't know if we've ever discussed before. There was a kind of classic work on the 19th century American Lutheranism by, I'm going to butcher his name now, Virgilius Firm. You familiar with the book, The Crisis in
Uh,
American Lutheran
yeah, only
Theology?
because you've talked about it before. So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. And,
so I
and
have a
so
copy.
he's writing in the late 1920s. But he almost kind of like sets the paradigm how we've looked at it for the last 100 years. That there's this crisis between like an American Lutheranism represented by like again the people called the New Lutherans and this is his own term, the European Lutheranism of like these more confessional. Well, I mean, it would be a surprise to tell Charles Porterfield Krauth, who I think is I have to double check, either a fourth or fifth generation American, that he's somehow a European Lutheran. So much of this shift is happening just as much by immigrants in the United States, as by many of these American born, some whose ancestors have been in the United States for, over 100 years. So it isn't this conflict between American and European Lutheranism. They're all Americans in many ways, in different ways and in different emphases. But yeah, that's kind of one of the big things I'm trying to show in this book, that just because you're speaking German doesn't mean you're not American. And also just because you're more confessional, that's not like somehow more European. In many ways, like the 19th century, the 19th century American Lutheranism, I, I mean, this is where people become more confessional. I mean, we were just talking about our friend Edward Moldenke,
Yeah.
this figure you're writing about and researching now, and how he says the same thing. How in America he became kind of more confessionally Lutheran, right? And so yeah, and so I'm also trying to show, as we've highlighted already, the role that the Civil War and Reconstruction context plays in that whole shift.
Yeah, good. So I think to conclude kind of the content discussion for today, you make a point that all these different factions that we find by the end of the 19th century, or at least after the Civil War, they all kind of reflected or epitomized the values of the nation they call home. And how are they all kind of saying, well, our brand of Lutheranism is
Yeah.
also an excellent reflection of what it means to be an American. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, and this is something that again, this is the thing with any research project, you just don't expect going in, but just how no matter which, whether they're General Synod, General Council, Synodical Conference, and, and again, as I've mentioned, there is really by the end of the 19th century, yes, there's important differences between those three major federations, but they've kind of converged around this shared identity, even I think this often surprises people, even in the General Synod, which had been like the home of the new Lutherans or the new school Lutherans, as they come to call themselves. By the end of the 19th century, their position on the Lutheran confessions is quite similar to that of the General Council, right? So they're becoming more confessional as well. But yeah, no matter which faction, they're all convinced that they are quintessentially American, right? And so that, I mean, it takes a variety of different forms. This is across the board. You have this emphasis on Martin Luther as kind of the origin of American liberty to some degree, whether that be religious liberty. Some will even go as far as saying like kind of political liberty, you know, just like Luther and the at the Diet of Worms, and his protest, you see these ideas reflected in the Declaration of Independence. Although, to
Yeah.
be fair, I think there are other Protestants besides Lutherans who make that same move. One interesting way is you see some Lutherans, you see this especially in like the Missouri Synod, saying that what the United States has done is given the Lutheran Church to blossom as it never had before, right? And a lot of that is rooted in the religious freedom of the United States. So now with Lutheranism unconnected to the state, it can really be the church it's supposed to be. One of my favorite ones that I encountered is this. I think it's either someone in the General Synod or the General Council. I'd have to double check. Basically, he has these series of long articles where he makes the case that no, you don't find the true origins of American nationhood in the Puritans or like the Cavaliers of Virginia. It's in the Pennsylvania Germans. Those were those were the real proto-Americans in the colonial era, and it's
Yeah.
their ideas that really shaped the United States as it came into being. So I mean, there are exceptions, obviously, but by and large, Lutherans are convinced that not only that their faith is compatible with American identity, but some will even go as far as to say, Lutherans in many ways make the best Americans, you know, and I mean, and maybe we chuckle at that a little bit, but I mean, they really believed it, and this was not just a rhetorical flourish. And I think it's something that's yeah important to emphasize in the history of this time period.
Yeah, not even if those maybe are out there who don't see that Lutherans are indispensable to understanding American history, Lutherans wouldn't have it the other way around, right? Yeah,
Right,
no, it's totally interconnected. We are not cut off and separate from the idea of being American. We are
right.
actually laser focused, to use a
Yep, that's right. Yeah,
anachronistic metaphor, yeah, to being an American. Yeah.
yep, yep. I think that's exactly right.
Yeah. Well, anything else just about the content or the research or the even the general arguments or goals of your book that we haven't talked about yet that you want to
I
cover yet?
mean, yeah, I don't want to. Well, you know, obviously, I'd love to talk about the book for another hour, but I think I laid out most of the key arguments. There's more to discover in the book that I wasn't able to get into in our conversation here. So yeah, I mean, I could talk a little bit about the research for the book if you're interested, if you think your listeners would be interested in that, or if we're coming up on time, I'm also happy to move on to other things.
Yeah. Well, let's a question I used to use a lot that maybe I didn't put in our notes for today, but let's just kind of summarize it. Can you think of something in your research that just kind of surprised or excited you or something about the process that you kind of will keep with you?
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I think well, yeah, and this is actually a subject we mentioned before, and it's maybe worth returning to. I think the issue of slavery was really interesting to me because I think there's the kind of paradigm in American religious history is, and you take, for example, the Presbyterians, right? The old school Presbyterians were the more confessional Presbyterians, and they were also the ones that either leaned in the direction more of pro-slavery or at least were kind of hostile to anti-slavery positions, whereas the new school, more revivalist, if you will, Presbyterians tended to be more anti-slavery. So there's that kind of connection between, and that's kind of the paradigm most people have. I was just really interested how actually during the Civil War itself, with the exception of a group called the Frankian Synod, which is an interesting group that we could spend a whole
Hmm.
podcast on, but among like if you will the kind of mainstream of American Lutherans, the most vocally anti-slavery were actually the old school Lutherans during the Civil War. Often Samuel Schmucker gets held up as this kind of the leading anti-slavery Lutheran, and in the antebellum era, he certainly probably was. But during the Civil War itself, it's actually people like Krauth, it's people like Passavant, it's that are the most vocally arguing that the abolition of slavery should be part of the Civil War effort. Now, I think most of them, maybe Passavant accepted, but like someone like Krauth would see like preserving the Union, that's like the chief goal, but abolition of slavery is kind of a salutary outcome as well. But that surprised me. So it kind of shows one of those things where like I went into it not expecting that, but being
Mhm.
open to finding, oh no, this is actually what they really believed. That it's different than what I had supposed. It doesn't map onto the kind of accepted paradigm. So that's just one example. I mean, I'll just say also like the religious newspapers of the Lutheran Church during the 19th century are such a amazing resource. I mean, they just have everything in them, you know? I mean, in these 4 page, sometimes weekly, sometimes, bi-weekly papers, I mean, you you're just scratching the surface, when I mean, you could spend, yeah, well, I did spend, years going through them, but again, like it's amazing all the different things that are in there, and I think I still think they are one of the key resources for understanding, and this is not just American Lutheran history, but understanding kind of American religious history as a whole in the 19th century. There's really this sense of, yeah, the press as this important agent of putting out, of the religious press of putting out key ideas. And many people kind of rally around a particular church paper as kind of like expressing their views. So they really kind of become stand-ins for the different competing parties in the Lutheran Church. And I think you see this in other denominations too. So there's so many sources out there.
Yeah.
It's just there's so much more to explore.
Yeah, having, done a couple articles myself on Lutheran newspapers of the era, yeah, it's definitely interesting. It's almost as if you have a better grasp, a better pulse on what the leaders of these Lutheran groups actually thought or their takes on everything. Like,
Yeah,
sure, today you have all these, anyone who wants could have a podcast, like right now,
right.
right? But it's not necessarily the people who are in positions of most influence
Yeah,
within their church bodies who are kind of pouring out their opinions and takes. It's almost the op. Well, it could be anyone
yeah,
could write in a letter to like the Lutheran Observer and could get it
right.
published. And quite often that was the
Yep.
content. But then you also have these are the leading figures, are the publishers themselves, who are presidents and professors all at the same time.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean, it's just as you said, it's a window into the views of like the leadership, but it also is, I think, a window into the views, which are sometimes difficult to come by of, lay people who are again like writing a letter to the editor and they get printed, and kind of like often echoing their views, but sometimes pushing back against like their views on a particular theological topic or in the case of the Civil War political topic.
Yeah. Yeah, always new ground to turn over when it
Yeah.
comes to those sources, and pick your topic, and you could probably find a lot of material there. So finally, to wrap up, you made a kind of concluding remark, which I thought was, without going over the top, a bit profound, and I want to see if you could give a profound answer. Well, no pressure, but
Oh yeah.
you said something along the lines of that religious denominations are more likely to be shaped by their context and culture when they don't recognize their context and culture. Well, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, maybe I was trying to be profound and it was, you know,
Well, I liked it.
that- but here's what I mean. I think the church always operates in a larger cultural context. I mean, that's true today. That's true 50 years ago. That's true in the Civil War era. That's true throughout history. It's just an inescapable fact. And so it seems to me there's two basic options. You can be attentive to those contexts, engage intellectually with the the debates and ideas of the time in which you're living. Or the other option is often just to be carried along by the surrounding culture. I mean, there is some matter of like insulation that can really happen. But I actually think like Lutherans, well, it's kind of up it's kind of I'll leave it up to the reader. You know, we're Lutherans truly attentive to the surrounding culture or just kind of carried along, right? I think that's kind of an open question I leave in the book. And so, you know, I'll let the reader decide.
Oh,
But I think that's something that as I was researching this as you know, as a 21st century Lutheran and Christian, you know, to what extent are we really engaging with the intellectual currents of our time? To what extent should we? And what does that look like? I mean, these are questions I don't have great answers to necessarily. Or sometimes are we just being kind of carried along by the larger culture? Yeah, I think that's something that we all need to wrestle with.
yeah. And the measure by which they did or didn't do this is kind of the what drives the book, right?
Right.
To some degree. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for spending this time talking about your book, The Fruits of Years of Labor. I'm sure you're glad, most of all, that it's now in concrete form
Yeah.
and people can benefit from your efforts. So thank you so much, Dr. Grunmeyer, for your time today.
And thanks for having me, Ben. It's always fun.